In Chapter 10 of your book, Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change, what did you mean by Lyme takes flight?
Well, in my chapter that I've called Lyme Takes Flight, I describe the ways in which ticks are moving around the planet. And, we have archival data as to where ticks could live years ago. And for that, I thank scientists in general, who I have an incredible respect and affection for as a result of the studies I've done of Lyme disease. So, for example, in the 1950s, a scientist climbed an Alp in what is now Slovenia. It was then Czechoslovakia. And the scientist found that ticks couldn't survive any higher than 700 meters. Well, 50 years later, we're looking at this problem of ticks, and another scientist climbs another Alp in the same area of Eastern Europe and finds, lo and behold, ticks are at 1,100 meters. Something has changed in the environment. It's basically warmer at that 1,100 meters than it was in the late 50s when that first scientist went out. Well, we're seeing that also along the coast, for example, of Sweden. We have archival maps that showed where ticks could survive from 1943 to about the 1980s. They couldn't go any higher than the 66th parallel. That latitude was basically, stop, you won't survive any further north. Well, now they're at the 69th parallel. They have moved about 200 miles in that period of time from the early 80s to about 2010 or so. So we know they're moving. And we know they don't climb very well. They don't walk very far. They're moving on the backs of mammals, sometimes deer, but moreover, they're moving in the feathers and around the eyes, mostly, of birds, of migratory birds. We're finding ticks above the Arctic Circle in places where you would never expect to find them. We're finding people in a small town in Russia, in the Arctic Circle, who are testing positive for Lyme disease because birds have brought the ticks to those places because the ticks are surviving.
In Chapter 8 of Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change, what did you mean by not just Lyme?
Yes, I often do concentrate on Lyme disease because it is the leading tick-borne illness that we're dealing with in America and in the world today. But there are other dangerous pathogens that are carried by ticks. Probably the second leading one that we should be concerned about that are carried by the black-legged tick that gives us Lyme disease is called babesiosis. That is the disease that the pathogen known as Babesia imparts. And if you get bitten by a tick that is carrying both of those pathogens, you will get much sicker than if you were infected by either one alone. We have scientific studies that show that the illness is much more difficult to overcome. The other thing is that you may be tested for Lyme disease because your doctor may be aware, may see your symptoms and say, you're sick and I want to check for tick-borne illness, but may not think to look for the other things that ticks carry. And when you're treated for Lyme disease, you're generally given a short course of antibiotics, which may not work. In 10 to 20% of early treated cases, people continue to be symptomatic. That aside, though, those antibiotics are not going to help for the babesiosis that you may be suffering, which can give you chills, intense fevers, relapsing kinds of fevers. And because of that, you need to be treated with an anti-malarial drug. Babesiosis is akin to malaria. Very different class of medications. Beyond this, ticks are giving people things like ehrlichiosis, a serious acute disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, a different tick, basically imparts that, the American dog tick. And there is some discussion that the Lone Star tick can also impart that. So there's just a gamut of pathogens that are floating around in the environment that, like Lyme disease, like Borrelia burgdorferi, have likely been around for eons, for a very long time. But we have just provided all of the elements that have made it possible for not only ticks to proliferate, to move, but also for the pathogens they carry. And some of the pathogens are quite deadly. There's something called Powassan virus, named for a 7-year-old boy in Powassan, Canada, who was infected years ago and who died as a result of the virus that he got from a tick. We're seeing more cases of Powassan virus. It is considered to be rare, but it has a high fatality rate, and we don't have any treatment for it. It's in 50% of the people who do survive, they are left with disabling neurologic damage. So there's just a menu, and it's growing, of organisms that ticks can give to us, and we need to pay attention to that. And I'm just going to add to that one reason why that's really very important to concentrate on. There are vaccines in development for Lyme disease. Right now, a group in France called Valneva is working on a vaccine to basically protect us against Lyme disease. If we're bitten by a tick, it will fight off the organism. That remains to be seen, how effective it will be and whether it will have side effects. But that said, we cannot be complacent thinking that we may get yet a vaccine for Lyme disease. We can't go walking out in fields and think, oh, we're protected against ticks, because ticks carry other things. And there have been suggestions made that babesia, what the cause of babesiosis, as I described, the malarial type of illness, may one day be as big as Lyme disease is today. So a Lyme vaccine is not going to solve our problem. Perhaps something like an anti-tick vaccine, something that when a tick bites us, it falls off and dies, or simply falls off at least, does hold some promise, and there is some research being done into that.